You know I don't like sitting in the middle.
We do have some of our people here, so that's so nice.
Is this for us, or is this?
No, that's for them.
And if you, I don't know if there's any context in which you want them to.
I'll have them
And
come up.
anybody who's out there.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is a committee meeting in regards to item 61 on the agenda today, the resolution, memorializing a resolution for rental protections, including rent stabilization, to be expanded to all 62 New York State counties. My name is LaToya Allen. I'm the 4th District Counselor. With me, I have Counselor at Large Timothy Rudd, Counselor at Large Steve Thompson, 3rd District Counselor Bren Lovejoy Grinnell, and Counselor at Large Michael Green. And so what we'll do is we'll have you introduce yourself and then kind of give us an overview of this resolution.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Rebecca Garrard. I am the statewide housing organizer for Citizen Action, and I am also the upstate coordinator for the Housing Justice for All Alliance. There are 9 bills on the platform that we've been pushing, and this resolution speaks to 2 of them because those 2 are the proposed legislation pieces that are really relevant to upstate and specifically Syracuse. We'll start with the ETPA expansion. So ETPA is the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, and it is the rent stabilization system that has existed in New York City and 3 surrounding counties since 1974. There is a current bill that proposes that those geographic restrictions be removed and that any of the 62 counties in New York could access that rent stabilization system. ETPA only applies to municipalities that have a vacancy rate of less than 5%, and it also only applies to buildings with 6 or more units that were built before 1974. What's really important to know about this legislation too is that ETPA is an opt-in scenario. So if this legislation passes, it does not force this system upon any municipality. It simply gives a municipality the right to form a research committee to see if it's a good fit for the municipality, and then be able to choose it as a tool in their toolkit if they think it's something that benefits their city. So that's the first bill. The second bill is called Good Cause Eviction, and the lead sponsor out of the assembly for that bill is Assemblywoman Pam Hunter from Syracuse. And it's a far more impactful bill of the 2. So it essentially provides 2 renter protections. One, much like it's named, it says that a tenant cannot be evicted without good cause. And while that seems common sense and many people think that already exists, in fact it does not. So if you're in a month-to-month tenancy, you can be given a 30-day notice of eviction without any reason or cause.
So this would eliminate the use of 30-day eviction?
It would say that to give somebody a 30-day eviction, you had to show good cause for that. So non-payment of rent would qualify, and a 30-day eviction notice would be issued. Damage to an apartment would qualify as good cause, and a 30-day eviction notice would be issued. What would not be allowed is an arbitrary eviction. So this is really important for our communities for 2 reasons. One is that we have residents who are the most marginalized, right? Residents in poverty, residents of color, who are the most marginalized members of our communities, who are living in situations that are unsafe, inhumane, and they have no ability to advocate for themselves around repairs because they fear a retaliatory eviction. So you can't say this is not acceptable that I have sewage bubbling up in my bathtub. You can't say that I'm not all right with the fact that the ceiling is caving in due to water damage, because the landlord knows that he can just issue you a 30-day eviction notice and somebody else will move in. So that's the first and foremost really important piece of that. The second is that when we have development, which can look like good development, but also can look like predatory development, and we have displacement of communities due to that development, we are finding across the state, and this is certainly true here as well, that corporate real estate interests are buying buildings and literally giving tenants 30-day eviction notices out of nowhere. So you've lived in a place your entire life. It's your home that you've known, you raised your family there, and all of a sudden you come home one day because the building's being sold and you have 30 days to get out.
Where is that happening here?
So I couldn't give you a specific building, but we certainly have residents and advocates in the audience, so I'm a statewide organizer, who can certainly speak to specifics. But
Okay.
I will tell you,
You said here in Syracuse that was occurring.
I can give you one here. I would have to look up the exact address, but it's on Till Ave, and a few people reached out to me. They had to be out by May 1st, and I think they told them the beginning of April, so they were scrambling trying to find somewhere to move. I can find the exact address though, but I know it is on Till.
Why?
and if
It's a new company came in and purchased it, and so everybody had to leave, and I guess they're gonna go and remodel and probably raise the rent and rent it out to other people. But I can give you that address.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate any info relative to Syracuse.
Yep.
absolutely, we can get that.
So what would you say is
Go ahead.
an acceptable time frame? Like, for example, if say someone, the neighborhood changes, a new person buys that building, they do want to remodel, they do want to do something, they do want, how would you resolve that situation in an equitable way, in your opinion?
So there's two pieces to the bill that are good, and I don't want us to forget to get to the other piece, but let me continue to answer questions about this first piece. So I think we need to think about development in a way that benefits all of our communities. And when we have corporate development, it tends to come in without care on the impact of the residents. And so there has to be some planning around that. So some solutions could be that they find alternative housing with another building that they own that they can move them to instead of just delivering a 30-day eviction notice, right? So that has happened in Rochester, where companies have worked with the tenants to say, here's another building I own, let's work on, finding you alternate residences so that I can go in and do renovations. So that's one way to fix this. I also want to point out that this bill protects good tenants. And so if we're talking about community developers, right? So people within our communities who want to renovate buildings, which is important, right? Renovate old housing stock and make repairs. That is encouraged more almost under this because they want to inherit a good tenant, right? This bill protects good tenants. And so if you have a tenant in that place that is protected under good cause, that means that tenant has paid rent, that tenant has been a responsible tenant. And so it's our assertion that for community developers, this is not going to hurt them, because if you look at that model, they really actually would prefer to inherit good tenants. And then the model is more to say maybe renovate one apartment at a time, as opposed to just displacing an entire building in a 30-day sweep.
Okay, I have a number of questions about that, but I'm happy to have you go on to your second prong and then return.
Okay, let's do that. So the second piece of this is that it equates an unconscionable rent hike to an arbitrary eviction.
Definitions are important. What do you mean?
Right now in the bill, it's defined as 1.5 times the consumer price index. What you need to know is that there are carve-outs in this bill for development, such as what you're talking about. So if you're a mom and pop landlord, which is the expression we hear a lot as a pushback against this bill, you will be protected in numerous ways against being able to maintain affordability as a landlord. So if you replace the roof, you can pass that cost on to the landlord. There's a ton of rebuttal language. Onto the tenant, yes. There's a ton of rebuttal language in
What
that.
period of time? How?
Indefinitely. I mean, obviously you can't say to them,
Not like a lump sum.
yeah, I mean, you can't say, I expect you to pay $10,000 next month to cover the cost of
Right,
my
right, but
roof.
If you can't say that, then what can you say?
So it would be up to the judge to determine what's a reasonable rent hike to cover the expenditures laid out by the landlord. If property taxes go up because of reassessments, those costs can be conveyed upon the tenant. There are numerous situations in which reasonable costs can be passed along. What it prevents is gentrification, really. It prevents the fact that if you are in a building that you've lived in your entire life and some luxury complex pops up next door, your landlord can't say, even though I've made no repairs to your building and nothing about your living situation has changed, I'm now able to increase your rent by $500. That would be disallowed under this. And we think that's an important benefit to the members of every community, including Syracuse.
Except to the extent that the assessment has gone up.
If their property assessment goes up, they can pass that cost along. But if, in many cases, assessments happen usually, I don't know about Syracuse, but in my experience around the state, assessments usually happen once every 4 years. I don't know if that's typical here, but that's...
No, we just don't do it.
Okay, so then there's that. So usually these rent hikes are not based on the fact that a property assessment has gone up. They're based on the fact that a landlord can charge more and say it again?
They can charge more just because.
Just because. And all of a sudden, a person who's called a home their home for however many years has just been placed in a situation where it's no longer affordable and they have to leave just because a development popped up next door. And again, as I said, we firmly believe, and Assemblywoman Hunter...
Alternatively, you could say in communities where people have rent protection for extended period of times, people stay in apartments just because they have rent protection. So you stay in a 4-bedroom apartment because your rent has never gone up, when in a competitive market you would probably leave and somebody else would move in, right? I mean, just because.
So I think when you move into an apartment and you determine your affordability in living there, which a good metric is 30% or less of your income, and we know that in New York State, 50% of the renters are rent burdened, which means they pay more than 30% of their income in housing costs. And we've had homelessness rise 36% across the state since 2010. Those two things go hand in hand. So I would assert that if you move into a building because you made a responsible choice that it was affordable, and a building pops up next door that allows your landlord to arbitrarily raise the rent, thereby putting you in a situation that is no longer affordable, that's a problem. And I would assert that if you took the time to find affordable housing that you knew fit into your budget, you should be able to stay there if you're a good tenant. So I don't see that as a problematic issue.
Okay, I have a couple questions. Isn't retaliatory eviction already prohibited by law?
So if it's only prohibited if the person has made a complaint to code enforcement. That's the only prohibition.
That was the example that you used, was that the tenant called codes and then they get...
No, I actually said they complained to the landlord.
So just them complaining to... So there's some group of people that just complains to the landlord, my stove doesn't work, my heat doesn't work.
Correct.
And they're being evicted. But if they're making a claim, which I've represented lots of tenants in landlord-tenant court, oftentimes they're making claims to codes and they're being evicted. There are protections already in place.
If the complaint was made to code, there's a protection. If the complaint was made to the landlord, there is no protection.
Do you have any reason to believe that this is an issue in Syracuse, that people are making complaints to the landlord alone and not to codes?
So I
Certainly
think
codes is pretty well known. People know they're supposed to call codes, that codes will come and.
I
Well,
think
you
at
can't
this,
you can't make the assumption that everybody calls codes. 'Cause
Oh,
some
sure.
people
I want to
yeah.
know to what extent is that a problem?
it's a huge problem in Syracuse, and I think actually we have someone in the audience who works tirelessly in here in this municipality and spends every day in court.
Okay, well,
With
then we'll get
people,
to her. Then we'll get to her.
So
I
she
have
can
other
certainly
questions.
answer that question.
Okay. Does the good cause eviction protection only apply to 6+ unit apartment buildings?
Thank you for asking that. It does not. The only carve out in terms of structure is it's buildings that have 3 or less units that are owner occupied or exempted. Other than that, any other building is covered.
So what about the owner who no longer wants to be a landlord and
Mm-hmm.
wants to sell the building and doesn't want to sell the building encumbered with current tenants? Is there protection for that, or is that person required then to sell the property as a renter, as a
Correct.
rental unit? Required to sell it as a rental?
No. So if they're selling it, no. If you are renting it out and somebody else is going to buy it and move into it, then it's automatically exempt because it's an owner-occupied property.
It becomes exempt at the time of the sale.
Exactly, because it becomes an owner-occupied property.
But then the owner, the new person who bought it then has to evict the person who was there?
Well, then the person would know at the time of sale that this building is switching to a building that falls under the protections of good cause, to a building that no longer falls under the protections of good cause. And so they would move before that sale was finalized.
What if it's not owner occupied?
If it's not owner occupied, then you were lucky enough to inherit the good tenant that was there.
I'm unclear on the details of what you just said, because it seems as though the property is not owner occupied until the sale occurs,
Correct.
which means that the person can't be evicted until the sale has occurred, which then puts off by 30 or more days when that tenant has to get out so that new owner can take possession of the property.
So I feel like we're operating under the assumption that tenants try to put themselves in untenable situations, and I'm going to push back on that, to be honest with you. Under your scenario, a tenant would not want to start finding a different place to live, knowing that that building is about to not fall under good cause protections, and would essentially, I'm not sure what you're asserting, but not be proactive in finding another place of housing, knowing that that building was not going to be able to be rented to them anymore. So I know tenants, and I know tenants don't like to be put in situations where they're forced out in 30 days. So in my knowledge of working tirelessly with tenants, I see the vast majority, when they know this sale is coming, being the responsible people that they are, who just want dignified and humane housing, working to find that housing instead of putting themselves in a position of needing to be given a 30-day eviction notice and scrambling to find housing. So I don't see that becoming some sweeping problem.
I agree with you that I think good tenants would do that same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But law is made for the worst case scenario. That's what lawyers do, is they work with the worst case scenario.
Sure.
Law is made for
Sure.
if people don't do what we want them to do, then and it seems as though that problem is not responded to by this law. In the worst case scenario, yes, the owner occupant would have to actually have deed to the home before eviction proceedings could be initiated, which seems like a problem.
So again, let's remember that this bill doesn't protect anybody but good tenants. So if this had been a problematic tenant, they would have been evicted before the sale, because this bill does not protect anyone who's not a good tenant. But yes, I can imagine in some scenario that if you bought a house and there was a good tenant, I suppose maybe you would need to delay moving in 30 days. So I guess what we need to do is ask ourselves we have to weigh, right? The enormous level of protections that we're offering the most marginalized members of our communities who are being displaced and are forced to live in inhumane conditions against the few scenarios where that might happen. And
Again, it's not weighing. I mean, it sounds like it's a fix that could be made. That's not, I mean, it could be 30 days before the sale happens or at the time the contract is executed, that's when the 30-day notice goes to
Sure.
the tenant. It's a simple fix that
I
could solve
can,
the problem.
I can pass that feedback along to Assemblywoman Hunter's office
Okay.
as a possible
When does
modification to the bill.
Okay. When does good cause attach? If you've been a renter for 1 month, does there have to have been a written lease preceding the month-to-month term? When does good cause attach? If I have someone who's a tenant, who's been a tenant for 15 days, and they're on a month-to-month lease, never been a written lease, does that attach? At what point does it attach?
Immediately. And so I just want to pause, though, because again, since we're only talking about good tenants, I don't see that as being a problematic situation. I don't foresee where that could be a problematic situation, because if they're a bad tenant, then you could evict them.
I can see these protections, I think, are fantastic for big buildings, for buildings of 6+ units, where this is clearly only ever intended for an apartment building, where they're only ever, maybe they'll make renovations, maybe they'll reconfigure the apartments, but this is always going to be a rental unit. But when you're talking about a 1 or 2 unit place, which a lot of our housing stock is in
Yeah.
Syracuse, which is maybe different than other urban areas, there's a lot of 1 to 2 resident to home buildings. I think this law has potentially an inequitable result on those places, because we know that people are buying and selling those properties fairly frequently here, and I think any restrictions that we make on having to take on tenants that after you sell a building really restricts people's ability to sell their real estate in a condition that someone's going to want to buy it in, because maybe someone wants to. I mean, I will say, I owned a property, I lived in it for a long time, moved, kept renting it to one person, and that would have severely restricted my ability to sell it if that person coming in had to then take on that tenant if she chose not to move out by the time the sale had occurred, knowing that those people who wanted to buy it couldn't come in on the day of closing. And we have a lot of properties in Syracuse that are like that are small properties where they might be owner occupied at one point and they might be rentals another point. And I think that's a problem.
So I think you're just restating the same problem you did before, with all due respect. That scenario is the exact same scenario that we just talked about, right? And so I said I would pass along to Assemblywoman Hunter the idea that maybe we could attach, if a building is moving from a non-owner occupied rental to an owner-occupied rental, that we could do a carve-out for that. But I'm not seeing anything different in the situation you just laid out than the one we just discussed.
I think that has to do with the attachment of the good cause. Whenever we label someone a tenant who is able to use that good cause eviction protection, that's why I asked about the timing of it. Did they have to have been there for a certain period of time? Because I think that adds a second layer of, I think people are sometimes in flux. Am I renting? Am I going to live there? Or maybe is a family member going to move in? And so if you say, oh yeah, you can live here for a month, and then my nephew is going to move in with his family or whatever, and then you can't get that person out. I think that's another layer of the problem.
Right. So
to what I said before.
So there is. I should have mentioned this. So I'm glad you brought that up. There is also a carve out for taking back possession of a property for a family member. So in that.
More? Oh, great.
So in that scenario, that would be a cause for eviction if you have a family member that wants to move into the house. So it's not just yourself as an owner, but one of your family members. That would be a cause for eviction. But if somebody bought it as an income property and was maintaining it as an income property, they would inherit, fortunately for them, the very good tenant that had already been there.
Okay. Any other questions?
How do you evaluate the trade-off between gains in equity versus losses of efficiency in a regional market?
Can you explain that a little more?
So a lot of economics is like dealing with efficiency versus equity. So this is definitely a,
I guess I just don't see the impact on efficiency, so that's what I mean by explaining that a little more.
so in like economics 101, they talk about price ceilings. This is a price ceiling. It makes it so you get less supply. It causes deadweight loss is the economics term, which people don't get. Joe Driscoll, you got $20?
Yeah.
Can I have it?
No.
I'll give it to you back.
Maybe.
Can I get $20? Just give me the $20.
Okay.
Anybody got a $20 bill? I need a $20 bill.
I don't know what you're getting at, Tim.
You can
really
finish your
want one?
I
point.
really want one.
Oh, okay. I thought this was a hypothetical.
I mean, deadweight loss is like a really complicated thing to understand.
Don't rip it up.
I'm not gonna rip it up.
I've seen this magic trick
I'm gonna
before.
cut it out. This is deadweight loss. Deadweight loss, it just poofs. I'm gonna give him a different one. $20, like poof, gone. That's the efficiency loss that happens with this. You're gonna get less housing because people make less money on housing. So like price goes down is lower than it should be, so people produce less of it. I mean, this is like in every economics class.
So I can,
So that's the loss. of
I can
efficiency.
happily send articles from some of the leading economists in the country to the Common Council that would say the exact opposite about rent systems such as this, number one. Number two, while cutting that up was, I'm not sure what sort of analogy. There are people that are starving and don't have a home, so that was a real waste of $20.
I don't know. I took a top-rated. I went to the Maxwell School, and my econ professor in the #1 ranked public policy school in the country did this exact thing to demonstrate what deadweight loss is. and the
Well,
effect of
okay,
the
so
price
that
ceiling.
was another $20 that for people that can't eat or don't have a home could have really used it a different way. So perhaps
But
the
that's
economy
what-
schools could think of another analogy.
Okay, so
But
in the
anyway.
law, it says the
Something to
ultimate
inform
objective.
us.
I know, I appreciate
It's
it.
not helpful to be argumentative.
I'm not trying to be. I'm really not trying to be. I'm just trying to actually ground this conversation in what I think it needs to be grounded in. And that,
So can you, so answer,
So it says the ultimate objective of state policy is to transition from regulation to a normal market of free bargaining between landlord and tenant. So it seems like this is a move away. I mean, that's what it says in the one law. It seems like this is a dramatic move away from just the free bargaining of between landlord and tenant to more regulation. Like you just said, a judge was going to determine the rent increase that's appropriate.
So we believe that the housing crisis in the state, and I don't mean this in an argumentative way, I mean it in the way that I feel it passionately in my bones because I travel the state and see people in crisis and on the verge of homelessness or who are homeless. So please don't mistake, if my passion is being mistaken for being argumentative, my apologies, but you really need to understand the place I'm coming from. And I appreciate the chance to answer these questions. We believe that the real estate industry is profiting off of tenants and will continue to profit off of tenants. This is a statewide law, so it's not going to put Syracuse at a disadvantage when compared to any other municipality. So any developer who wants to develop in the state is not going to avoid Syracuse because they're going to find the same situation in any other municipality. And so if you're saying that you think that it might impact in a negative way some of the profits of the real estate industry, again, I can send you some really good articles from economists who think it doesn't hurt economies at all. But I can also say to you that I think there's plenty of profit to be made by the real estate industry while offering tenants protections from predatory price increases and predatory development.
and just to be clear, I don't understand the confusion because we don't represent the real estate industry. Like that's not who we represent. Like we represent the tenants, which are the people.
And some
that live
people
here, but it
own
seems like
homes that they
it's-
rent who are
right.
also voters.
But right now, it seems like the support is more on the opposite side.
Can I
Go ahead.
jump in here for a second? So I just want to say a couple of things for people's consideration. And if you could bear with me for a minute, I got a couple of questions too. Anybody know the median income in Syracuse? Quickly.
18,000?
Just over 32,000. Anybody knows the per capita income rate in Syracuse?
19?
Just over 22,000. It was 19 in 2015. That understood, from my perspective, and really it ain't my perspective, it's just math, right? I always make the argument that the one science that is absolute that you cannot discredit is addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And the math will either support it or it will discredit any argument that anybody makes. I don't care what you're talking about. And to me, I'll start by saying there's I think, confusion, not necessarily saying on the part of anyone here, because I wasn't here for the whole discussion. But in the discussions I've had and watching the comments, there's a serious confusion about the difference between affordable and low income. That's the first thing. And they're not the same thing. The other thing that has to be understood is that affordable should apply blanketly across the board, right? So a person who makes $32,000 a year should be able to have decent housing at what is a respectable rate. Equally, because a person makes $150,000 a year, don't mean they shouldn't have access to that same affordable property, right? Because at some point they'll probably spend more money and we'll catch them out on sales tax. To me, affordable makes sense. It makes economic sense, and no class will discredit that, Tim, with all due respect. In regards to the $20 bill, I happen to actually agree. I would have taken a piece of paper and wrote 20 on it and had an imitated $20 bill and cut it up as opposed to cutting up, and I don't know if that's legal to cut up money. I'm just saying. But I think we have to give consideration to that. And while I understand the point that some property owners live in the city, most do not. And we do represent both real and artificial citizens here, but there needs to be a balance. Right now, there is no balance. People are priced out of homes. We have a property management problem when it comes to finance. That's why we have a land bank, because people can't pay the costs. Landlords can't keep up with costs because people can't pay the rents. You know, so it's just not smart. Last thing I'll add, we have large student housing buildings that are not at capacity, and they won't be at capacity for as long as they are $1,500, $2,000 a month. You know, so I think we just have to give consideration and make a smart effort toward reaching some kind of balance and or homeostasis. You know, I don't think efforts to assure that everyone has access is a bad idea. I think, you know, and I won't comment on anybody else's thoughts about it, but if we're just talking about making sense with the money and making sure that people have access and giving people chances to sustain themselves and their families, regardless of their income, then you have to give consideration to managing how some living spaces are rented. Last thing, we have rental places in this city that are $2,600 a month or more, and they can't find anybody to pay for it. We have very big buildings, brand new, I won't say where they are, whose rents are $2,200, $2,300, $2,500 a month, and they can't get tenants. It ain't that it's people that can't pay for it, because even people who make $200,000 might think that's not a smart investment. So I'm just kind of putting it out there that we have to be, I think, and I'm not suggesting that nobody's not, but I think more consideration should be given. And if we stick to the math, then I think the personal can kind of be taken out of it. Thanks.
If I could just,
Do you really want to?
Be personal so I can get you.
all right, I'm gonna be personal. No, I mean, I respect passion, and I respect, understanding where you come from. And I come from here, and I also spent 7 years in New York City. And I think affordability is a function of two things. It's a function of income and housing prices. In New York City, there's a affordability crisis because rents are so high. In Syracuse, there's an affordability crisis because our incomes are so low. Okay, so in very distinct markets, why is it that this is the appropriate solution for both?
So, oops, let me move this
I
back
think
down.
you gave the answer. Our incomes are too low.
So again, I don't want us to ignore the first part of the bill, which spoke to giving voice and advocacy to our tenants who live in housing situations which are completely inhumane in their standards. And so the first part of this bill allows those tenants to speak up against these conditions without fear of retaliatory evictions. And I know a request was made to hear from one of our community experts up on those, and she can certainly tell you her experience on a daily basis of how that happens, and it's a thing here. And then on the affordability side, you know, if incomes are low, it's hard to find affordable housing. And right now, what I'm hearing from the people on the ground in Syracuse is the housing that's affordable to them is problematic. And everybody deserves dignified housing, no matter their income. And I would concur, yes, as I said earlier, affordable housing is 30% of your income. So it is exactly true that it is not the same as low-income housing.
I definitely agree that we have an issue with housing quality, but I don't see a price ceiling as a solution for improving housing quality.
So let's just be clear too, it's not a rent stabilization system like ETPA, good cause. It attaches to the tenant, not the building. So if that tenant is protected from an unconscionable rent hike, if that tenant moves, the landlord can reset the rent to whatever they want. This is really a bare minimum renter protection bill, and yet vitally important.
Can I ask one question? I'm confused here because I'm not confused by what you're saying. I'm confused by what will we be voting on the resolution? The 9 bills, one specific part of the bill? What we're going to send to the state? I agree with what you're saying here. But we're being asked to go forward with a resolution. You said to begin with, there's 9 parts to it.
Right. So
What are we doing?
Your resolution is to call on Albany to pass ETPA expansion and good cause. Those 2 bills. That's it.
The 2 bills.
Correct.
You started saying there were 9 bills.
I was explaining that the organization I work for has 9 bills on their platform,
We're speaking about.
but the Syracuse,
Are the
because
2
those are the 2 that will impact Syracuse. The other 7 will not. So I would not ask you to vote.
And my second part is this specific to the city? I note that it says counties in the others, so.
So you're referring to ETPA because good cause is, yeah. So ETPA is only allowed to be opted into by 8 counties right now. And what we want to do is remove those restrictions. But within each county, different municipalities have the options to opt in or opt out. So an entire county wouldn't opt in. Each municipality within a county can make an individual choice.
So we have a few minutes. I'm going to ask Councilor Green to speak, and then right after him, Palmer, if you can come up.
Okay. So actually similar to Councilor Rudd, I was a renter in New York for a while, and they're about as different as you can get in terms of urban housing markets. There's a lot of similarities, but there's differences.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously their affordability, no doubt about it, it's the biggest problem. And here, I was able actually to go with Palmer and look at some of the situations, and what I witnessed is situations where the landlord is just literally doing whatever the cheapest possible thing you can do to maintain the housing. And sometimes even beyond that, it was eye-opening for sure. So my biggest concern is what we need in those kind of situations is investment in the housing to bring them up to acceptable standards. And when you look at 1.5 times CPI, it kind of sounds like a lot, but here the last couple of years for a $500 lease, it's like $10 to $12. And so I guess my question really is, can you speak a little bit more to how the mechanics it would work in terms of allowing for investment in the housing to be included in the rent? Because when I looked at the bill, I just didn't get a full understanding of that part.
So, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So again, if we are encouraging landlords to improve properties, which we want, there is all sorts of rebuttal language in the bill that allows those costs to be passed on in a reasonable manner to the tenant. So if a tenant is exercising their right that they would now have under this bill to express concerns about these conditions, and the landlord actually addressed them in a positive way, then he could raise the rent accordingly. And I'll also say, in terms of how really we can kind of baseline this, but like it's a great bill, but it's also very baseline renter protections. It's incumbent upon the tenant to enforce. So if the landlord raised the rent, say $50, because he'd made some improvements, and the tenant disagreed with that because they didn't see the improvements, it would be incumbent upon the tenant to take the landlord to court to get the issue that was an unconscionable rent hike. So it's not as if the landlord has to go get pre-approval. It would be the responsibilities lie solely on the tenant to go to court and say, I think this rent hike was unconscionable. And actually, I'll be honest with you, we're using the word unconscionable. You know, these things are still in committee. I think that word is likely going to be changed to unreasonable or undue. But right now, the language in the bill is unconscionable.
So I guess, yeah, and that's one of my things, is just making sure that it gets fleshed out in a more concrete. So, you know, I'm in a hypothetical situation where I'm a landlord and I think the apartment needs a new stove.
Yep.
And the stove's $1,000.
Yep.
I just want to make sure that landlord would know, okay, this is what I'm going to be able to charge in rent.
Yep.
You know, and it's going to be extra $40 or whatever, some kind of formula.
Sure, where he can recoup it. Yep. And so he can do that without any legal proceedings. And then it would just be incumbent upon the tenant to take that landlord to court if they felt that the rent increase did not match some sort of renovation. And again, if the judge disagreed, then the rent increase stays.
Let me ask a follow-up to that then.
Sure.
But if the tenant, for example, doesn't pay, and then there's an eviction for non-payment,
Mm-hmm.
and the tenant says, I can't pay because my rent went up $40, $100, whatever it is that an affirmative defense for the tenant to say, I didn't have non-payment? Can the judge then consider whether?
The judge would then look at what was the rent increase based on.
And the judge will
And-
assess at that point whether it was
Exactly.
reasonable.
And if the landlord has receipts to show that improvements were made, which correlate with the rent increase, then that would not be able to be used as an affirmative defense.
Okay, I'm gonna ask Palmer if you can come up. We got about 15 more minutes.
Do you want me to?
That doesn't mean we have to take up the whole 15 minutes though.
Okay. My name is Palmer Harvey.
Pull the mic right down, it's flexible.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Palmer Harvey. I'm the co-chair of the Housing Task Force of Southside TNT. And Jamie and I have been community activists and volunteering in the community for a while now, dealing with housing issues. And one of the things in the last year we've been really feeling strongly about is tenants. Because first we started out being this big effort with lead, and then we moved into tenants. We're like, oh, what about the tenants? We have not done anything about tenants. And when we started doing things about tenants, this is what I found out. And so I'm going to read you a thing I wrote up. So in Syracuse, there's a quiet epidemic of poor condition rental housing. As I visit different neighborhoods, I often wonder if I'm in Syracuse or in a third world country. I try to glance away from the broken steps, the burned out homes, the rotting roof, the pothole in the parking lot that looks as though asteroids have hit it. But I can't, because I would also see is little feet playing among the broken shingles that have fallen from the roof of the apartment they live in. Homes that look abandoned from the outside, but have little eyes staring at me from behind windows that are broken. A tenant who is facing these issues often feeling stressed and full of anxiety about their living condition. You know it's hard to sleep when bed bugs are biting you, roaches are crawling all over you, your kitchen sink does not work, and the door to your apartment is in a state of disrepair. So not only does the tenant feel stress and anxiety, but now has to feel unsafe as well. Tenants who are in these horrific living situations are in a state of constant anxiety because they think they have no real power to change their situation. I know what all you are thinking. Why do they just not move or call code enforcement? Tenants often do move. As we all know, people often move once per year in Syracuse, but the quality of apartment rentals have gotten so bad. Tenants no longer have a good choice of an apartment to choose from. Now tenants go and look at apartments with the mindset of what I am willing to live with. Code enforcement for tenants to use when they are brave enough to use it can be a good tool, but sometimes tenants who live in poor and quality apartments are often threatened with eviction when they do. I've seen the reality of this threat when I go and observe court proceedings in landlord-tenant court. In most cases, these people who are evicted are women. This is why good cause eviction bill is so desperately needed. Tenants should never be afraid to report bad living conditions. Thank you. So, you have any questions?
Can I add something? I want to maybe add something in addition to, because I thought the question that Councilor Green asked was a valid one in regards to property upkeep. But I think one part of the question, or one part of the discussion that's missing, is that when tenants move from what is undesirable housing, because of the cost of the housing that's up to code, or the housing that's more respectable, they can't afford it. And so they have to move into what is essentially a similar condition that they try to get away from.
Can I add something, Counselor? These pictures I have here, these are things where I do part of my job is I'm a community researcher. I study eviction, and these are not in the homes I were meant to go into. These are people running to me because I have this shirt on. You know, at the time when I'm going to do other interviews with people in the apartment, coming to me, see, my apartment's bad. You need help me. I can't do this. Well, I said, the first thing I say to him, why didn't you call codes? Well, he keeps starting to evict me. He keeps starting to evict me. What can I do in that case? I know I don't have any real power other than to tell them that. And so, and you think these people have been living here for years. These people only live in these apartments for 1 year. 1 year. This is not a 1 year symptom. This is the actual condition of that apartment. People are getting sick because they didn't properly close up holes where air conditioners were supposed to be. Properties where the dust and mold, you can't really tell how bad this apartment from this black and white photo. It's ridiculous. And this bathroom, my God, the actual visual of it is disgusting. It looks abandoned, and children were living in it. So I'm completely baffled as to why we're having this discourse about good cause eviction. Because I want to take back something to this tenant to say, you have something to fight with. Wait, hold on. I'm not finished. Because as a tenant myself who has also faced these same issues, well, in my case, it's property management company. That's a whole other story on that. Because in my property, I've only, the property I live in now, I've been there 3 years. In the 3 years, in the first 2 years, I had one. In the last 6 months, I've had two. And imagine complaining. All your stuff you complain about gets pushed off. And or deferred is the last thing I got. So, yeah, people need something solid. And for you, our representatives, who are out here supposed to represent all of us, are you truly representing all of us? As our t-shirt says, we're over 60% of the city, and yet we get no respect. It's about lining your pockets, but you're lining your pockets with our money. So I just discuss it right now because these pictures are only three. I put three that I have right here. I posted 15 of them on Facebook. You know how many? I posted this on May 2nd. Today is May 6th. And since that day, I've had over 5,000 clicks and views and comments about the deterioration in the city. So just to read you just a couple of these things, these comments from people. I said, good. This is why I absolutely refuse to put a single dime of my own money in my apartment. My landlords are slow, very slow to respond. And we have to make big issues of things before will answer me. Some words are very prevalent. I've seen the worst when making home visits. Sad to say, reality. I've seen condemned housing being rented out, boarded windows. And finally, my house looks like this too. This is ridiculous. Why are we having this argument? You guys have the power to do something about it. Just do it. Thank you.
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to have Deputy Mayor come up for a second.
Can I please go, because she did this whole thing before the deputy mayor comes up. And okay, so Palmer, I respect your work. I totally agree that the conditions in much of our city are abhorrent, right? And to the extent we're having this debate is because I do not believe this law will improve any of those conditions, okay? So I do not believe that with this, that landlord will then invest. We have a crisis because we have allowed properties that should have no value to have value because we haven't gone and cited them for code and financially penalized slumlords. Like, we have to make the worst properties very unprofitable for them. I do not see this as that solution. So that's why. I'm not here because I don't think it's it's absolutely abhorrent. I do not believe this will give you anything that you're asking for. And I think we need to literally, which we're doing with the Bureau of Administrative Adjudication, we need to go in, we need to fine landlords who are not that way. Until we make being a slumlord not profitable, people are going to continue to do it.
If I could add real quick, let me disagree with you respectfully, Counselor, because I think you missed the point that I just made. While your statement may be true, that this law may not cause this landlord to invest in an upgrade, it will allow this person to move into more respectable housing because they can actually afford it. That is the point that I just mentioned that I think people are missing, is that the reason why they're moving from one slum, if you will, to another one is because they can't afford what is considered more respectable and more decent. That is the point of the legislation.
And this isn't a end-all, be-all. Like, this is it's a collective effort. So what we're doing here with the city and other efforts, and with this law and other resolutions, is a collective effort. There isn't going to be one thing that fixes everything here in Syracuse. Like, this isn't going to fix our housing crisis. It has to be a collective effort. This is just a piece to the bigger picture. So thank you, Palmer.
Let's get this one fixed. What's the address of this house?
Can I have Sharon come up?
So we
Go
can
ahead.
get people down there and,
Yep.
leave?
No, you can have a seat, but you can just give him the address, like, on the side. Yep.
What is it?
Because we only have a few minutes.
What is it?
She'll get it to you.
Yeah, she'll get it to you.
Tenant on blast.
Go ahead.
She'll get it to you.
I do want it, I want it blasted, that's why.
Well, if it hurts the tenant, we don't want to do that.
Well, yeah,
Right,
that's what I'm
yeah.
saying. That's the whole point. That person will get retaliatory evicted because with the top folder, that's on the west side of the city. This particular landlord owns about the whole block in that radius. That person that you see in the top person that's standing there, she ran over to me. I wasn't actually at her house. I was at someone else's house, and she ran from me a block away to come get me because her friend, I was interviewing her friend her apartment who was owned by the same landlord. She's like, I got somebody else. And she ran from her apartment to run and get me before I left. So
if we
I don't,
have to do something about this now, if we send codes over there or something, you're saying that
I always want to roll my eyes when you say codes because I know the process, because it's a lengthy process. But in that time, what's happening to the tenant? We're forgetting about the tenant because to be honest with you, that apartment needs to be demolished. I'm not even gonna lie, because the amount of money that would cost to bring that up to code, it's ridiculous. And that landlord's gonna slapstick something on there just so it could pass code, because either your code enforcement policies are very basic, what they allow to pass. But I've seen people who order because the doors on their actual apartment so bad have nailed a little thing shut to a turn and so blocked so people can't get in.
So
I'm
what we'll do is,
confused.
hold on one second, Palmer. So if you want the address, you can get that from her over there on the side. Thank you very much.
doesn't
Can we
endanger
have
the
Deputy
tenant,
Mayor
yes.
come up? Right.
Just really quickly, Ms. Palmer, is that
No,
correct?
that's Palmer.
Palmer.
That's Rebecca.
I'm sorry, I had just two questions. So and I can't remember, it was further back, and it might have been during the conversation about the good cause protections.
Yes.
You were referencing good tenants versus bad tenants. Is that language in the actual legislation? And if it is or is not, if it is, how is it defined?
Yeah, so it's not, and I think it was language that started in the conversation that I would push back on, so thank you for pointing that out, right? What the language that is in the bill, it allows for evictions based on reasonable circumstances,
Okay.
such as non-payment of rent,
Okay.
such as damage that is tenant inflicted to a property.
Okay. My other question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I heard you right, that there would be opportunities for judicial determination in these cases.
That's correct.
Is the legislation add additional resources for municipalities like Syracuse City Court that has waiting lists of housing eviction court cases right now? And we would
So
potentially
it,
be adding the caseload burden.
right, thank you for asking that. It's a budget neutral item. All of these bills are budget neutral items, so they do not incorporate any money. But we actually believe that the tenant eviction proceedings would decrease because the majority of those are not based on good cause. They're arbitrary.
So there will be less evictions.
So you're going to have less
They
proceedings.
be arbitrary because they don't have to demonstrate cause, so they just don't do it.
Again, I can speak to the statewide conversations that I have, but no. I just was in Albany yesterday for work, and I had a man stop me because his building was being sold, and the entire building was given a 30-day notice. So now you have an entire building of people going to eviction court for an arbitrary reason.
Okay, so I'm gonna end this committee meeting.
One last question, Councilor Allen? Just really briefly, so we clarified between the
And
nine.
briefly meaning, we have 4 minutes.
Yeah, but between it's not the 9 laws that were on there, just the 2. Could you summarize again, just really quickly, Cliff Notes, exactly everything that's in the resolution?
Correct. It's calling upon the legislators in Albany that represent Syracuse to pass 2 pieces of legislation, and the bill numbers are in there. One is the removal of geographic restrictions of ETPA.
Didn't you say in the beginning, though, that cities that wouldn't apply to municipalities with more than 5% vacancy?
Correct.
Sharon, we're more than 5% vacancy, if I'm not correct, right?
So these resolutions are in the process of being passed or have been passed in about 15 cities in upstate New York. And so
Okay.
that inclusion of that language is sort of twofold. One, it's to say that it's nonsensical to have a system that a municipality can opt into in only 8 counties and not 62. So the idea is that we say, no matter where you are in the state, if your municipality fits into that criteria, you should be able to opt into it. So in some ways, it's a solidarity vote. But I also will assert that vacancy rates in municipalities can change.
Yep.
And so I certainly don't think we want to, have to play catch up every time, a vacancy rate changes. We have some that are very close to the 5% mark. And then the other is just asking for good cause to be
Good
passed.
cause,
Yep,
okay.
those are the 2 things.
Thank you. Sorry for the.
No, thank
Just
you.
wanted to make sure I had it.
All right, thank you for
Thank you
coming.
for allowing
the
me to speak.
information.
Thank you.
Yep, and for my fellow counselors, if you need further information or you can always reach out to Pam Hunter. She wasn't able to make it today, and she couldn't send anyone else, but she's willing to answer any questions.
So are you going to call the vote today, or are you going to wait?